So this is less of a single story and more like a very complex braid threading together and interweaving a number of stories around one central point or feature, and that is that of the library and what it makes possible for us in terms of books. And I might have to break this into multiple stories just because there are so many libraries that I've been connected with, involved with at different points in my life. So I'll just start with, childhood. And I was very fortunate in that both on my father's and my mother's side adopted. They were people who very much valued literacy, reading, books, and I got kind of a leg up. I'm pretty smart, and my mom was able to stay at home while my dad was studying and as a tax attorney, and she worked with me as a kid, as he did with mathematics, to help me learn to read quite early. So by the time I was 3, I was actually reading, at least at a rudimentary level, and then it, progressed from there. And so on my dad's side, his mother, really valued books, made sure that we had a World Book Encyclopedia, which I would read quite a lot when I was younger. Sometimes I would just open it up to random pages and read entries. And on my mother's side, we have my Uncle Hubert, who I've talked about in other Sadler stories. I'll put a link to him. He was massively important in the history of my mother's side of the family, the Lemrises, because he was a really well-educated bibliophile who had only gone to 4th grade in school, but who amassed a vast, education by reading himself and engaging with other people. And he kept track of the books that he read, and he recommended books to other people, gave them as presents, asked them about what they thought about it, and was very much responsible not just for my mom going to college, but other people as well. And part of this was because he took them as kids to the library. And he wasn't a great driver, and this was in Chicago. So he'd pile all the kids into his car, and then he'd drive them to the library, and they would say it could be kind of a harrowing trip because he didn't pay a lot of attention as he was driving. But he got them to the library, and he got them introduced to all of these processes that so many of us take for granted of reading and using libraries. So, when I was a kid, we moved out to the border of Wales and Delafield, my dad and mom built a house in a new subdivision, which because of a recession didn't fill in very much. And I went to Wales Elementary after going to Brandybrook Kindergarten. And it was, the kindergarten was, I think, basically just 2 rooms. And the Wales Elementary building was literally a 4-room schoolhouse. It went from 1st to 3rd grade. And there was a basement. There was a parking lot where we did our gym stuff and a field. And then there were 4 rooms where all of our desks were and the teachers' desks, and we did our stuff. And I don't think that they actually had a library in that particular building. But before I went into 3rd grade, they built a big new Wales Elementary, and that one, I think, went from 3rd to 5th grade, and it consolidated a whole bunch of other schools into it, and it had a library. And the library was centrally located, as I think they probably, was the main design in the 70s. And you could wander through it and check out these books, right? Now, that was not my introduction to libraries. I mentioned that we lived sort of, in this town of Delafield on the very edge of it, right by the village of Wales. So there was also, we lived in the township of Delafield. There was the town of Delafield. And the town of Delafield had a library. And that library wasn't, big, but it was big enough for me. And the books that I remember getting from there, there were a whole bunch. It was a big thing. We would get into the car and drive down the road to Delafield, and we would go to the library, and we'd get our own library cards after my mom decided, that we wouldn't put it all on her card. When I say we, I mean me and my sister Laura. So, I remember they had like an entire bookshelf of Tom Swift novels. Now, if you know who Tom Swift is, you know that these are fun stuff for a kid. It's sci-fi, not particularly great sci-fi, and it's not even young adult. It's children's, maybe young adult stories. And you've got Tom, who's the inventor, and his buddy Bud, who's sort of the muscle, and they get into all sorts of hijinks. There was like a bad guy country, the Burgundians, if I remember, and they're obviously supposed to be the Russians, and all sorts of things ensue, right? And everything's wrapped up by the end of each story. So I had devoured those. There were also books about I remember there was this entire series about horror monsters. So like a book on the werewolf and a book on, Frankenstein's monster and vampires and mummies. And I really enjoyed those. Those were about films, And then there were a bunch of books that would be fitting into like the new agey occult things, like about numerology. And I read my way through all of that stuff as well. And then, whatever else I could get my hands on too. So, I enjoyed that. I read a lot, and going to the library was kind of a treat for me, and I think for my sister. So we had the Delafield Public Library, we had Wales Elementary's library, and that was, what I drew on, as well as books that my mom and dad had. We had our own little library in the house, and I'll also mention, when we would go and visit Indiana, where the Chez Lemre's complex is, where my grandfather and grandmother and Uncle Hubert and Aunt Tunny and Uncle Ernie and Aunt Bernice each bought and purchased, and planted homes, prefab Waukesha homes down on their retirement land. Uncle Hubert had an entire library within the basement, lining the walls, and that's where we had a lot of our meals. And so you'd constantly be surrounded by books. And he had cool stuff. He had National Geographics going back to like his birthday in 1913, and you could like look through these. He had all sorts of sci-fi and fantasy and explorer books, and he was cool with you taking anything you wanted to read. He had gotten a lot of these books himself by the closing of other libraries. He was the kind of person who, if he saw somebody getting rid of books, he'd be like, oh, no, I'll take those. And so he had tons and tons and tons of stuff. And so those were my main things until a bit later. And then I encountered two other really important libraries for my own development. And they were both, you could say, bigger, wider, deeper. So one, which I've already talked about in another story, I didn't go on in public school. I went to a private school where I got a scholarship called University Lake School. And ULS was the kind of place where, there were some people who were like super rich. There were people who were just rich. And then there were those of us who were there on scholarship. And at that time, it was just 6th through 12th grade. And the classes were pretty small, and, it was a good place in a lot of respects. I learned Latin there, and, there were other classes that I thought were pretty cool that I enjoyed quite a bit, including an anthropology class. But, I had to do work like all the other students, right? And as a scholarship student, you kind of got the crap jobs. So one of my jobs was to vacuum the library every day. After school, you'd have like half an hour or sometimes 45 minutes, depending on how long it took you to do your work. And you'd in my case, I'd vacuum in 6th grade. And it wasn't fun, but it was kind of cool to spend time in the library, in part because, I would work a bit and then I would screw off a bit and like look at the books and check them out and stuff like that. And, we spent a lot of time going to the library there as well as classes. And so you could, except for the special collection stuff, you could check out any book that you wanted to from the library. And so, that's where I actually got The Lord of the Rings from. It was ULS's copy, the ones that I read first. And so many other things as well, sometimes for class, sometimes just for learning. And because it was a really well-endowed school, it had a great library. I think a lot of those books were probably hardly ever taken out by other students because, a lot of the students were not particularly intellectually inclined. But it was sort of a, prestige thing for them to have a great library. And I imagine the teachers probably enjoyed it too. So that was one major, new library for me. And then public libraries. So, Wales and Delafield are west of a bigger, nowadays, city that's really part of the whole Milwaukee area. But at that time was kind of its own independent place called Waukesha. And Waukesha is the county seat. It was not a big city, but it was, an important place, sort of a hub for all of these other smaller communities around it. And Waukesha had a much bigger library. So my mom started taking us to the Waukesha library, and that was even more of a treat. And it was interesting, too, because Delafield Public Library, the most you could take a book out for was 2 weeks. That was it, right? Waukesha would let you keep them out for 4 weeks, so double the amount of time, right? And they had just, compared to these other libraries, tons of stuff, right? They had entire sections for fantasy and science fiction. They had, a history section. They had anything that you really wanted to find. Although there were a few books, I was into fireworks, something I've mentioned in another Sadler Stories video. And I did go to look up books about fireworks, and the stuff that would tell you how to make them, the pages were actually cut out because I don't think they wanted us carrying out our own little science experiments, or one of the other patrons had stolen them. But I used to check out tons and tons of stuff. It was something we would do every 2 weeks or so, go to the library, turn the old books in, get some new books, wander around, look through stuff. And there was so much great science fiction and fantasy and even horror that I got exposed to through that Waukesha Public Library. And, there were other things as well. I went on sort of a history jag. I got into let's find out about the Mongols. And compared to the other libraries that we had, they had so much more. I should mention that I went on to high school, and I didn't stay in the private school. I actually went to a Catholic high school, which was kind of a nice medium between the public school and the private school. It was bigger, lots more kids. There was a library there, but I actually didn't take many books out from it. I would more or less go to the library to hang out with friends during times that were study hour or something like that. You could go to the library. But we didn't do any research. We just kind of screwed off and, passed notes back and forth to each other and stuff like that. I went to the Waukesha library when I wanted to do any real research. I don't think the Catholic Memorial Library was particularly well-stocked back then. I'm sure now, because it's this beautiful place that doesn't look anything like the school that I went to. It's probably amazing. But the Waukesha Library was such a major hub for me. I could spend hours in there just wandering around and looking at stuff. And then when I was in high school, in Waukesha, because that's where Catholic Memorial was, I would often just walk to the library. And I had some friends who lived around there, so it was kind of a nice place to stop on the way. I was reading more and more speculative fiction, getting into history, reading about philosophy stuff, but mostly, reading about, different religious perspectives or books like Finite and Infinite Games, things that appealed to me because I didn't have any real guidance in what I should be studying or reading about. I read a lot of military history because I was into war games and I was planning on going into the Army. And, I read a lot of other stuff. If something was interesting to me and there was a section, well, I would just go and check books out and read about it. I didn't really apply that sort of diligence to my academic classes and studies. I was more just into getting whatever I wanted. And libraries are ideal for that. Really quite wonderful. And so that went on. And then, I went into the Army. And I will say that, I bought books at the PX and we would trade books back and forth. But they also had like a little lending library on our base, and you could go into the rec center and find books to read, novels or, science books or things like that. And, I like that. I'd often borrow books from people and read them and return them to them. And then I came back, and by then, my senior year of high school, we'd moved to Waukesha. And so I came back and I was staying at my mom's place and, working at Shakey's Pizza Parlor. And I would go a lot to the Waukesha Library. In my off time, I spent a lot of time there. I would bike in or walk in or take the bus and, walk around, get some books. By then, we were also, CDs were something kind of new, and I would check out CDs to listen to, music that I hadn't been exposed to. A lot of modernist classical stuff like Eric Satie and Debussy and Prokofiev and people like that. And so it was, it was very nice for getting exposed to things that otherwise I wasn't going to run into, And so all the way up to when I went to college, the Waukesha Library was a really important resource for me. I do want to mention one other, and then I'll cut this off, and I'll do another one of these videos talking about libraries in college and graduate school and beyond, because there's more to the story. But I do want to mention one other library that really, really impressed me. And this was when I was in high school. So we were doing a research project during junior year. And when I say we, I mean myself and Steve Utzerith, who was a good friend of mine, and one other student. Maybe it was Brian Ulrich or somebody like that. And it was in this combined AP English, American Lit, and American History class. And we were doing a project on the Ku Klux Klan and doing research, on where did they come from, what was their beef, were they active here in the Midwest? Answer is yes, with the second Klan. And what's their status? And so we didn't find enough stuff in the Waukesha Library. And so I don't remember whether it was Steve's mom, who actually was a Marquette professor, or whether it was my mom who suggested it. But we got a ride in from her boyfriend down here to Milwaukee, the downtown where the Central Library is. And the Milwaukee Central Library is an amazing edifice in several different ways. One is architecturally. The outside facade is just, amazing. It's beautiful. They don't make libraries like this anymore because it's pretty expensive. And then when you walk inside, through the front doors, it's marble, like all over the place, and it's gigantic. And there's this ceiling that's, up there, and it's got all these features to it. And you're like, holy crap, where am I? This is for books. And it's because, the people who designed this thought, hey, this city needs a really not just good library in the sense of having, being well run and having lots of books. It needs to actually reflect how important education, literacy, these things are, and the fact that any person who lives in the county can go in and access this wonderful resource. We need that reflected. And so, to us, this is like, whoa, this is pretty amazing. And then, of course, the holdings are way more extensive because it's a much bigger place than the Waukesha Library, let alone the rinky-dink Delafield Library. And so we found lots and lots of stuff. We found, all the sources we needed to write a good paper, do a good project. I think we had to give like a little presentation or something. And we couldn't check the books out, but we took lots and lots of notes. We couldn't check them out because we weren't living in Milwaukee County. We lived in Waukesha County. And then I remember sitting on those marble steps waiting for my mom's boyfriend to come and pick us up and just being like, holy crap, it's getting dark and we spent all day basically in there. I think we packed like bag lunches or something. And it was just an amazing time, And then we go out down these steps, get in the car, drive home, and you think to yourself, now that is a library. And I will say this, just to close. So the library that I'm talking about right now is a mere 5 blocks from where we currently live. I get to go there whenever I want to, basically. I mean, during hours that are open. And it is such a wonderful resource. I like to work there some of the time, to change the scenery a bit, but also because there's great resources and it's a fun place to be. And so, it's kind of cool that now in my 50s, something that when I was a teenager I experienced and I was like, holy crap, is this heaven, right? I can go there anytime I want to, basically. So, that's quite cool. The other thing I'll tell you about the Milwaukee Library is, like a lot of county systems, the books are spread around at a number of places, so you can request them from other places. But the Milwaukee Central Library has 4 underground storage tiers of books. And so its holdings are better, I would say, at that Central Library than quite a few small liberal arts colleges' libraries. It's really quite good. I've been pleasantly surprised by just how extensive the holdings are. So that's enough. I will do another one, because this is already getting a bit long, where I talk about college, graduate school, and then postgraduate studies in the libraries that have been massively important in my life, and I'll share those stories with you. And, feel free to write in comments about your experiences with libraries as well, because it's great to hear about other people getting the benefit of this really important institution that so many of us kind of take for granted, but took a while to develop historically. And it affords the possibility of, investigating things, getting information, maybe even getting an education to so many people, regardless of where they're coming from, what social class they are. So long as you can walk in and you've got a card, you've got access to so much.